Alex is Professor of Modern History at the University of Cambridge and Chair of the History faculty there. And as we know, she's an active and inspiring advocate for historical knowledge in her work at the university, but also as co-editor of Past and Present, as Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, the British Academy, and the Australian Academy of Humanities. She was recognised for her enormous contribution to historical knowledge with the CBE in the Queen's Birthday Honours in 2017. And as everybody here knows, Alex has shaped the field of early modern religious history through her career, including her monographs, some of which are on church papists, on Providence in early modern England, and on the Reformation of the landscape. Her recent work is changing our understanding of the place of memory, personal, collective, and institutional memory, in religious structures and experiences. It emerges from two major funded projects, the AHRC project Remembering the Reformation, and the Leverhulme project on the Reformation and the Generations. Her forthcoming publications include a monograph entitled Generations, Age, Ancestry and Memory in the English Reformations, which I think I'm right in saying, Alex, is based on the Ford lectures that Alex delivered in 2018 in Oxford. And I'm also very pleased to say that another forthcoming publication is a chapter she has written on the spiritual life cycle, which appears in a collection I've co-edited with Caroline Bowden and Emily Vine, entitled Religion and Life Cycles in Early Modern England, which is out this month with MUP, so order your copies now. I'll now hand over to Alex for her paper, which is entitled Leaving Legacies, Memory Practices and Lived Religion in Early Modern England. Thank you, Alex.
Well, thank you very much for such a kind introduction and for inviting me to this conference. And I want to start by apologising that I wasn't able to be here for the first session. I had to deliver a lecture in person, which was a novel experience. And I had the stressful aspect of having to work out how the technology for recording worked at the same time. So I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, so I want to begin by making a confession. I've always been a little ambivalent about the concept of lived religion. On the one hand, the emergence and proliferation of this phrase and concept over the last 2 decades signals a salutary shift of perspective and emphasis, a redirection of priorities that has displaced attention away from the investigation of official dogma and ecclesiastical structures, formal rites of worship, and the clerical personnel who performed them, towards explorations of religion as practiced by ordinary lay people on the ground and in the course of everyday life. It's a useful shorthand for historiographical trends that have brought neglected dimensions of early modern religious life under the spotlight, including the role of the emotions, senses, bodies, and objects, and foregrounded the complex and creative ways in which faith was subjectively experienced in this period. Patrick Collinson's influential The Religion of Protestants, published in 1982, was not, by his own admission, primarily a study of a living content of belief. It focused on the Elizabethan and Jacobean Church of England as an institution, on the casing of the watch, rather than the inner mechanism or mainspring that animated it from within. By contrast, Alec Ryrie's Being Protestant of 2013 sought to recover religion's beating heart and to illustrate that early modern Christians were more than creedal statements on legs. It exemplified the trends that this symposium and seminar series, jointly organised by Aix-Marseille and Queen Mary, has set out to investigate over the last 4 years. On the other hand, lived religion arguably carries some risks. It perhaps perpetuates some less than helpful assumptions rooted in the older polarities between elite and popular that once dominated scholarly work in this field. It implicitly sets prescription and practice, thought and action, doctrine and devotion, polemic and piety in tension, if not opposition. It tacitly contrasts abstract ideas and controlling organizations with the more organic and dynamic spiritualities of people on the ground, which are at times valorized as more autonomous and authentic expressions of faith and religion. The very adjective lived seems not only in some ways superfluous, but evokes a ghostly alter ego that is dry, desiccated, and dead. I am, of course, being provocative. The best work in this vein is duly attentive to the mutually constitutive relationship and dialectical interplay between structure and agency, institution and experience. It recognizes the necessity of writing a social and cultural history of religion with a theology put back, and of understanding theology itself as a living and breathing organism that emerges and evolves in response to its surrounding environment and circumstances. It also acknowledges the inextricability of individuals and the collectivities of which they are part, and the extent to which the private, interiorized forms of piety that we tend to privilege in the post-Reformation and post-Enlightenment definitions of religion that we've inherited cannot be disentangled from the communal and corporate contexts from which they grew and in which they functioned. As the presentations from Hex and the Centre for Privacy Studies have already demonstrated so well, the boundaries between them are porous and fluid. In this paper, I want to approach the broad theme of this conference by exploring one contemporary practice that draws some of these questions into focus: the convention of leaving oral, textual, and material legacies to surviving relatives and friends. This was a medieval tradition that persisted but was transfigured in the wake of the Reformation. I consider the powerful sense of responsibility that men and women and children felt towards their posterity, and the role that this played in the transmission of religious knowledge and inherited memory to their biological and spiritual descendants. In doing so, I build not only on an extensive body of scholarship from Maurice Halbwachs onwards that stresses the extent to which autobiographical and social remembering are symbiotically linked. I also highlight the value of the generation as an entity that serves as a bridge between the individual and the collective, as a capacious concept that meant both a group of people bound by lineage, kinship, and blood, and as a social cohort and imagined community linked by a common location in time and a shared set of experiences. The Reformation fundamentally reconfigured the theology of death by denying the existence of purgatory as a halfway house in which the souls of the dead could be assisted by the prayers of those still living on earth. It consigned them to a past to which surviving relatives no longer had access. It demoted them from their traditional status as a distinct age group. The forms of intercessory activity that had underpinned the medieval economy of salvation and forged an intricate web of reciprocal obligation were swept away. Indulgences, chantries, and an associated culture of efficacious and salvific remembering. Protestants were taught that there was nothing they could do to change the fate of their ancestors in the afterlife, or to smooth their own journey or that of their offspring to paradise. Technically, the effect was to break the sacred connection and sever the lines of communication between the generations. The significance of the moment of death was also recast. The eschatological battle between God and the devil that took place around the deathbed lost much of its urgency in a reformed universe in which soteriological decisions had been made before the beginning of time. The comportment of dying people in their final hours, in theory, became irrelevant. And yet the art or craft of dying persisted within Protestant societies in modified forms. The reformed literature of the Ars Moriendi, from Thomas Beacon's Sick Man's Salve and William Perkins' A Salve for a Sick Man, to Christopher Sutton's Disce Mori and Jeremy Taylor's The Rule and Exercises of Holy Dying, provided pastoral guidance for those facing death, peppered often with polemical slights against the greasy rites carried out by the papists. Such texts supplied guidance on the demeanour and duties of the dying, from preparing the last wills and testaments in which they confessed their faith in Christ, consigned their bodies to be buried, and bequeathed their material goods and chattels, to reading scripture, examining the conscience, combating fear, doubt, and despair, and bestowing benedictions upon their children. Providing valedictory exhortations and discourses to the family and friends who gathered for their passing was a further responsibility. The ancient custom of imparting sententious wisdom prior to expiry was not disrupted, but revitalized by the Reformation. The verbal pronouncements made by those in the liminal zone between this life and the next continued to be revered. Terminally ill children were accorded an authority and gravity beyond their tender years. Their pious utterances acquired a quasi-prophetic quality. But in this gerontocratic society, however, the usual pattern of transmission was from the older generation to their successors. Protestants found compelling models for this in the Old Testament patriarchs. The dying sayings of parents were conceived as a means of conveying religious and family values to the young. In a context in which death could be sudden, unexpected, and premature, it served as a proxy for the task of personally instructing them. It was an extension of the responsibility of catechizing and educating children, servants, and other dependents in morals and faith laid out in handbooks of domestical duties and household government. The pious advice that fell from the lips of those about to die was frequently recorded for the benefit of posterity. The instinct to preserve the precious pearls they offered to those assembled around the bedside in writing was widespread. Conscious that the grim reaper might take them by surprise, many took the precaution of preparing them in advance, especially as they advanced in years and passed milestones in the human life cycle. In a culture of inheritance that revolved around primogeniture, fathers felt compelled to guide their immediate heirs in writing. Renaissance humanism, as well as Protestantism, helped to rejuvenate the tradition of setting down pithy precepts for the instruction of elders' sons when they entered the state of manhood. This 17th century manuscript by Henry Hastings, Earl of Huntingdon, was written in the winter of his age to direct his son Ferdinando when he reached his ripe years. It cultivates a robust anti-Catholicism alongside loyal devotion to the established Church of England, as well as warning of the dangers of Sabbath breaking and idle recreations. In a letter to his heir, probably written in the 1630s, Sir Richard Grosvenor urged him to make his own house a Bethel, a house of God in which the Lord was diligently worshipped and served. Individuals on the evangelical wing of English Protestantism supplied advice about how to discern whether they were true believers or unregenerate hypocrites. Containing a list of the 41 marks of a child of God, Thomas Hunt's bosom companion to his sons and daughters, composed in 1690, was a device for assessing whether they'd experienced a true conversion or second birth. Sometimes this responsibility fell to grandfathers when their own offspring predeceased them. If the leaving of oral and scribal legacies was a manifestation of patriarchal masculinity, it was also an extension of commonly held assumptions about maternal responsibility. Mothers too had a duty to nurture and succor the young, from drilling them in the ABC and catechism in their early years to steering them towards virtuous living as they advanced towards sexual maturity in marriage. Written around 1606, Elizabeth Ashburnham's instructions for her 4 daughters explicitly evoked the precedent of the Old Testament, which laid down the duty of passing on knowledge of the Lord down the generations. She articulated her conviction that as God hath made me a means for the life of their bodies, so I may discharge the care that is committed to me, which I most respect for the good of their souls, whose salvation will be an unspeakable comfort to me, an everlasting felicity to themselves. Her epistle or admonition to her children included various short sentences worthy often to be remembered, together with godly and fruitful meditations that she hoped might also be of benefit to the household and the whole Church of God. Still in its original vellum binding, tooled with the letters EA, this text was self-consciously written for a family that stretched outwards in space and forwards in time, reflecting the paradoxes inherent in Protestant temporality. She looked forward to a future moment in which she herself would be reduced to dust, but also when her own offspring would become part of the blessed inheritance of Christ, members of the small remnant of the elect. In an era of high maternal mortality, many women expected that their words would be perused posthumously, either as a result of their death from complications in childbirth or as a consequence of a subsequent illness. In 1656, on the very day that she felt her first child quickening in her womb, Lady Anne Halkett set down in writing a series of religious and moral instructions for her unborn daughter or son. The mother's will she penned was composed in anticipation that she might not survive the infant's delivery. A surrogate for speech, it contained conventional advice on conduct and piety, from prayer, Bible reading, hearing sermons and receiving the sacrament, to bridling the tongue and avoiding ostentation and pride, slander and backbiting. It also expressed her earnest hope that they would live to see the toppled Stuart monarchy restored, and made nursing fathers and mothers to preserve the purity of the church, which is now rent and divided by schism, heresy, and error. 9 months later, when she gave birth to a healthy girl, she jotted down an effusive thanksgiving for this mercy, which had turned my mourning into joy, in her notebook. Sadly, it was little Betty who died of smallpox, aged just 3, in November 1660, tearing a great piece of my soul from me. As examples such as these attest, the leaving of legacies was a social convention and a settled rite of passage, shaped by tradition and inherited scripts and formulae. But it was also an intimate, personal, and familial experience that took place in the semi-private domain of the closet and bedchamber. The survival of such manuscripts in archives and libraries powerfully attests to the transmission of generational memory. These textual heirlooms function as autobiographical and biographical objects, material artifacts that help to demarcate the boundaries of natural and artificial kinship groups and give expression to senses of familial and spiritual identity. They're consciously envisaged as a mechanism by which past generations can communicate with subsequent ones from beyond the grave. The trajectories they've followed are both patrilineal and matrilineal. This was a process that involved both transcription and custodianship, copying, curating, and co-creating. Now in the Folger Library, Sir Francis Fane's commonplace book was given to his son at his coming of age, incorporating several epistles that fell from my worthy progenitor's pen upon the like occasion. This little manual opens with the advice that Francis's grandfather, the eminent Puritan and founder of Emmanuel College, Cambridge, Sir Walter Mildmay, left as a memorial to his heir Anthony, copied out of the original. It also includes the letters that Francis's mother and grandmother had sent him in imitation of the spiritual guidance that Lois and Eunice gave to Timothy in New Testament times. Other texts followed the same path. Walter Boothby's nosegay of everlasting orifical flowers includes an extended counsel addressed to his dear and loving children, Rebecca, Thomas, Francis, Mary, and Hannah, whom he entreats them to carefully peruse and endeavour continually to follow. As my blessing, I bequeath it fully to you all. This is dated 1640, but the names of two further daughters, Sarah and Martha, have subsequently been inserted. A marginal note summarises this as the bowels of a tender father to his precious babes. The preservation of the manuscript is itself a measure of filial affection. The memoirs of the Yorkshire gentlewoman, Alice Thornton, supply a further compelling example of the emotional resonance of these textual legacies. She describes how her dead father's book of advice to his son George disappeared during the chaos of the English Civil Wars. Entrusted by her mother to an uncle to protect as the richest jewel she had, it was seized by parliamentary soldiers, but a copy made by a cousin providentially came to light. Rejoicing in its recovery, she conscientiously kept this facsimile for her own offspring. Her own extended account of God's mercy in preserving this parental legacy was intended to revive the memory of the blessing we enjoyed in his life, wherein he imitated the great father of the faithful Abraham to instruct and teach his house and children in the ways of God, and to command us by his holy writings, a pledge of his lasting love and care of our precious souls to all posterities. Transcribed several times at her behest, the original was bequeathed to her eldest daughter and then to her descendants. The flyleaf bears an inscription by her great-great-grandson, Thomas Comber, dated 1789. For others, there was no better legacy than Scripture itself. They ventriloquized their hopes and dreams for their offspring through the holy words that the Lord himself had left to the faithful on earth. The noblewoman, Susanna Beckwith, dedicated her Geneva Bible to her daughter and namesake in terms that closely echo those employed by Alice Thornton. My dear child, I leave this book as the best jewel I have. Read it with a zealous heart. Encased in an embroidered binding worked by her own mother, Mary Bradley's King James Version, which incorporated a register of family births, marriages, and deaths, was in turn handed down to her children, who continued the tradition in fulfillment of the desire of my ancient parent. Such texts were remembrances of people who'd passed from the world, as well as poignant reminders of the moment of their death. If they were what Alinka Rublak has called grapho relics, they were also memento mori that provoked those who handled, touched, and read them to contemplate their own mortality and meditate upon the instant in which they too would breathe their last breath. The verbal and scribal legacies I've been describing must also be situated on a continuum with the material heirlooms that dying men and women bestowed upon their kith and kin, and which are recorded in wills. The gifts of rings, pendants, girdles, gowns, bedheads, cupboards, silver plate, and tableware, which men and women entrusted to later generations as remembrances. Encrusted with spiritual symbolism and biblical inscriptions or iconography, they too were simultaneously reminders of the worthy dead who'd once possessed them, and mechanisms for instructing and edifying posterity. In the wake of the Reformation, the pious preambles in which testators bequeathed their souls to God and their bodies to burial themselves acquired spiritual and confessional significance. They became self-conscious statements of contested beliefs and professions of faith that deserved emulation. Famously, the evangelical language of William Tracy's will led to the posthumous exhumation of his corpse as a heretic in 1532, providing a template for the testaments of many subsequent Protestants, whom it helped to instantiate as a virtual and real community of godly people. Thirdly, I want to investigate the manner in which the textual legacies that early modern people left to later generations migrated from speech and script into the public sphere of print. As I'll suggest, the crystallization of this genre of text into a literary commonplace did not preclude it from looping back into and colouring and inflecting the lived experiences out of which it grew. The 16th and 17th centuries saw a steady proliferation of publications purporting to be parental legacies, from single sheets and inexpensive pamphlets to bulky treatises and tracts in a range of formats. William Cecil, Lord Burleigh's manuscript Counsel of a Father to His Son appeared as a broadside, and one of the best-selling ballads of the period was 100 Godly Lessons, which summarises the proverbial advice dispensed by a dying mother on her deathbed. It begins by exhorting her children to mark well my words and keep thy parents' will, and ends by telling them to print well in your remembrance the lessons I have shown, then shall you live in happy state when I am dead and gone. In a later variation on the same theme, The Old Gentlewoman's Last Legacy, the matriarch starts by bidding her sons and daughters adieu. These stylized representations of generational transmission perpetuated a trope that was centuries old, but which gained a new lease of life in the era of print and in the post-Reformation world. The appetite for didactic advice about how to live and die well among humble and middling sort buyers was fed by stationers such as John Trundle, whose matching books for fathers and mothers supplied guidance for teaching their offspring to keep within compass. Andrew Jones's Dying Man's Last Sermon enjoyed tremendous success as a godly chapbook. By the 17th century, The Last Legacy had become a marketing device to entice devout buyers, a catch-all title that encompassed a wide variety of devotional writing. It's difficult to assess if F.S.'s, a dying father's, living legacy to his loving son falls into this category. The author, who hid diffidently behind his initials for reasons best known to himself, evidently survived long enough to prepare this pocket-sized duodecimo for the press. He hoped its contents would provide suitable sentences for children to copy out for their parents. This may have been an artful contrivance, but we should not lose sight of the legacy literature that does seem to have originated in domestic and familial settings, and which was posthumously published for a wider audience. The group of books that appeared after their authors' deaths as Mother's Blessings or Legacies provide particularly rich evidence of how the intergenerational dynamics of the deathbed acquired new dimensions in the domain of print. The widow Dorothy Lee claimed that setting forth her text to the view of the world was the only way she could carry out the solemn duty to her sons George, John, and William, bequeathed to her by her dead husband. Excusing her presumption in resorting to this medium as a product of motherly affection, she thought that this was the only guaranteed means of preserving her scroll of godly counsels for the edification of her orphaned children. She hoped their efforts would inspire them to do the same for their own offspring, envisaging a kind of apostolic succession of advice down the generations to create an unbroken chain of faithful witness to coincide with the one carried by blood. She also claimed the right to name future grandchildren, Philip, Elizabeth, James, Anna, John, and Susanna, that these godly significations might serve as a constant mnemonic to their bearers. Appearing not long after her decease, the book attests to the capacity of the last legacy to circumvent the prevailing cultural restriction on women's speech. Elizabeth Jocelyn's mother's legacy of 1624 was another set of spiritual instructions to a woman who correctly predicted her death in childbirth. Edited by the clergyman Thomas Goad after she died, Jocelyn's text presented itself as both a solace to its twin-like sister, the daughter who survived her, a deputed mother, and a deputed mother for her instruction. Goad consciously played the role of midwife in ushering her literary labours into the world, seeing in them the lineaments of her own parentage, the devout Protestant piety of her father, William Chatterton, Master of Queen's College, Cambridge, and later Bishop of Chester and Lincoln. He presented this bequest as beneficial not merely to her own unborn child, but also to the common kindred of Christianity. Inscribed in a large octavo notebook, neatly bound, gilded, and ruled in red, Elizabeth Walker's directions to her two daughters were likewise published by her spouse in 1690, the Essex minister Anthony Walker, with the aim that, in the words of Psalm 78, the generation to come might know then even the children which should be born, who should arise and declare them to their children. The appendix included directions written for them when they were aged 12 and 14, as well as prudent, pious counsels written to her dear grandchild, then at Felsted School, 2 months before she died. This may be called her last dying words. Walker exposed these writings to the light of day, not merely to commemorate her exemplary piety and charity, but also as a reservoir of edification for her friends, acquaintances, and for people who had never met her. In a similar way, the pious expressions uttered by a 20-year-old Devonshire maiden by the name of Damaris Pierce during her last sickness in 1679 were encapsulated in a tract in 1683, together with a copy of the written paper she left as her last legacy to her brothers and sisters. Their appearance in print followed their promiscuous circulation in private hands, not merely among her kith and kin, but also of some that were strangers. The text bears poignant testimony to the painful distemper that afflicted Damaris and rendered it difficult for the scribe at her bedside to take down her words verbatim, even using the time-saving technique of shorthand. The anonymous editor admitted that at some point his pen was laid aside and that she spoke so fast that none thereof was written. Such texts invited their readers to eavesdrop on the private pronouncements that parents and elders made in anticipation of their own imminent expiry, which was the precondition for their entry into print. They allowed them to vicariously experience the moment of death and to hear the words uttered by people on the threshold of departure from this world. A mechanism by which, in the words of Hebrews 11:4, he being dead yet speaketh, they bear witness to the persistence of a vibrant tradition of communication between the generations, despite the profound rupture wrought by the Reformation. This was strengthened by the reverence in which early modern people held their dead ancestors and their elders in faith, but which was simultaneously directed towards their descendants. The pose that Protestants adopted as they lay dying, and in the oral, scribal, and printed legacies they left behind, was both prospective and retrospective. A final example is especially revealing in the light of our theme of lived religion. Taken down from her mouth when she was in a very weakly condition and had little more strength to speak, the account of her spiritual experiences that Susanna Bell bequeathed to her mourning children told of the divine providences vouchsafed to the family in preventing them from perishing during the long journey by sea to New England, and on the return journey back across the Atlantic a few years later to their native country, as well as their deliverances from plague, fire, and earthquake. It told of the inner struggles with doubt and despair, and the pangs of the new birth that prefaced her admission to a gathered church as a babe of Christ. It described the sermons that ravished her heart and the way in which the Lord enabled her, in her words, to taste, feel, and see the sweetness of his word in the midst of her bodily infirmities. Susanna's legacy was an autobiographical narrative that traced the process by which she acquired experimental knowledge of the grace of her election and salvation. In other words, of her predestination. This was prepared for publication by the pastor of her congregation in London, Thomas Brooks, in 1673, who admitted that it was merely a partial and imperfect transcript of what she had said. This text bears witness to the emergence of a new sense and meaning of the noun experience, and of its growing use as a synonym for a state of heightened emotion and feeling. It's a text that illustrates how fervent Protestants themselves forged their own concept of lived religion. Paradoxically, those experiences came into being in and through the process of being remembered, and via the media in which they were enshrined and communicated to a broader audience. If in time they passed from what Jan Assmann called communicative to cultural and communal memory, they remained a vital stimulus and fillip to individual piety, feeding back literary formula and inherited convention into everyday life. They helped to create senses of generational identity that were orientated towards their future posterity, as well as departed ancestors, and which the ties that bound the living, the dead, and the unborn were spiritual and biological at the same time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Alex. That was such a beautiful paper, so wide-ranging, and I particularly loved all the visual examples you had so that we could encounter the variety of textual forms and material forms that these legacies survive in. And I was really struck in particular by the formats of the printed items. I think I often think of legacies as being, you know, continuous narratives, and when they're printed being in quite small format, things for personal reading, things to carry around. But those broadsides really show us the different ways in which that kind of experience could be circulated and disseminated. I'd like to open up to questions from the audience. Remember, you can raise your hand or you can type your question in the text box, in the chat box, and I can read it aloud. Yes, please, Alex, you have your hand up.
Hi, hi everyone. Sorry, my surname's not there. It's Banji. That's Sim. Alex, thank you so much for your wonderful paper. I was really struck, in particular, by your prompt to us at the end to think more closely about that word experience and you know what it might mean, rather than just kind of using it loosely. And I was also struck, having spent most of this week teaching students about the importance of experience in the sort of study of the body in this period, and that sort of, you know, classic shift from authority to experience in study. And so could you comment a bit on whether you think those resonances are around experience and how they relate to the broader context, and or whether you feel that this particular use of experience is something with a particular religious significance here?
Yes, thank you very much for that. I think it is very interesting that if you look at the shifting senses of the word in the OED, and using other things like early English books online, you do find that it appears to be in the 17th century that experience acquires this sort of very specific religious inflection as describing a state of mind or feeling forming part of the inner religious life, and an experience is both a noun and a verb. It signals a process as well as a state. So that's an extremely interesting element, and I think that word experience needs to be paired. I was thinking earlier of the presentation on these priv words that we heard in privacy, that experience, experimental, these things are akin, they're cousins, and I think that strong sense of in a context in which scientific practice is also increasingly emphasizing the experiential and experimental and observational element to things, that it's that sense of the word is emerging in that context. So I think I found that a very interesting observation. And if you look at the sort of texts in which the word experience is being used by the later 17th century, you see the same thing coming up over and over again, of that powerful sense of experience as a way of sort of as a shorthand for this sort of emotional and sort of inner turmoil and motion that is taking place in the souls of those who see themselves as forward and godly Protestants. Hope that helps a bit.
Thank you both. And just on that point about the word experience, Alex, it makes me think of how experimental religion is the term used particularly by those in the Puritan tradition right through the 18th century as their term for practical religion, for how to live, how to pray. And Mette, you have a question.
I think actually Mary was before me. But...
Sorry, I can only see one hand.
Okay, sorry. Well, then I'll be happy to ask my question. Thank you so much for a wonderful lecture. I really enjoyed it. So I was wondering, and that's probably a very difficult question to answer, but I was wondering for the handwritten texts, and you showed so beautifully how it was about copying, was about bequeathing, it was about the binding, and it was all this very sort of tactile. Do you see them mainly as artifacts, or I know it's not a question of either or. I think my question is, do we know anything about reading them? Or are they mainly sort of tokens of memory indeed?
I do think they are read, and I think this illustrates the insights that have run throughout the day, that the reading isn't simply silent reading or private reading. It's often public and oral reading that is, then instructing the families of those who've inherited these texts. And I think the other evidence of that, of course, is the way in which they are frequently copied out and transcribed by later generations. I'm so struck by several examples I have where they're written out as childhood writing exercises as well. So I do think that there is this very powerful ongoing cycle of passing on that's connecting the generations, far back, through to the 18th, 19th century at times. I think Mary Claire is got her hand up. Is she there?
Yeah, but I've been muted. Oh, yeah, and my video's been turned off. Probably a good thing. So it's not intentional. Thank you so much. That was a really interesting lecture and brought so much alive. And start my video, right. So Alex, I really want to know what happens next in the 18th century. And this is not a trick question because I know you know a lot about the 18th century. And I have done a lot of research, especially on the 19th, where, you know, there are a lot of similar practices, as people know. But I mean, and I know the narrative of secularization in the 18th century is beginning to be challenged. But I mean, on the kind of specific things you're talking about, I don't believe that these legacies from mothers to children stopped being published in 1700. So I just wonder if you could say more about what happens next. Is it different across generation, across denominations? And, you know, do you see any patterns in the 18th century?
Well, I think I should probably be turning the question back towards you, actually. But and I can't claim to have explored the afterlife of this genre in the 18th century in any depth. But I think I think what would be an interesting thing to explore. I think a lot of the examples I was using are really from that sort of experimental predestinarian tradition, and in the context in which there's a sort of a kind of turn away from those Calvinist theologies towards more Arminian theologies. It would be interesting to see how those texts are inflected. At the same time, there's a considerable continuity with really much older traditions. This predates the Reformation. These legacies. So there's again there's a kind of powerful undertow of this sort of generational processes that carry across that Reformation divide and across the divide of ruptures in society and the challenge of atheism and secularization later on. So, you might say, perhaps, I'm really speculating here, that actually, in a context of public unbelief, that, in the home and in the family, this sort of transmission of piety, arguably became, even more important. That's a wild speculation. You may wish to dissent from that.
No, thank you. And also it would be really interesting to know whether different religious denominations had different practices as well as, but I think the point about theology is really interesting. Of course, John Wesley would be a first place to look, but But well, and he had lots of correspondence with women. Anyway, thanks so much. And there's so much food for thought there.
Thanks, Mary Claire. I could just say a little bit about the 18th century too, actually, that I'm aware of quite a few instances of cross-confessional discussion about legacy, maybe in more informal ways than the ones you've been sharing, Alex, like in letters between Sally Wesley, the daughter of Charles Wesley, and Mercy Doddridge, the daughter of Philip Doddridge. They share a lot of their views about how to remember members of their family and and they're really conscious of their position in families with significant names from a religious point of view. So yeah, there's a variety of practices in the 18th century. Colin, let's come to you and then Raisa.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexandra. Really, really interesting. Let's just raise a couple of questions or a couple of ideas with me. Is it too simplistic to see the switch from Catholic practices to Protestant practices, in the sense that they maintain the link between the generations? The Catholic they have this responsibility to intercede, and that way thinking about the previous generation, and then the Protestant, there is more receiving advice and having another responsibility, the responsibility to follow godly advice. That's one idea that came to me. And if I could just say the second one, is that obviously that mostly literate people capable of expressing their experience in writing, and of course mediating that experience in terms of preparing it for the next generation. I mean, with that idea of mediation, how valid is that as an indication of true lived religion?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think there is some validity in suggesting that whereas the emphasis in the pre-Reformation world was on how one could intercede for past generations, that the Reformation precipitates a bit of a shift towards focusing more on how you can edify future generations and present generations. I think that there is some truth in that perception. Yeah, I think your question about the mediated form of these legacies, these testimonies, takes us right to the heart of the question of lived religion, which was really what I was, really revolving this all around, in the sense that, I think what this illustrates is that one shouldn't assume that these legacies are simply composed of, inherited formulae. My argument is that they cycle in and out from the literary domain and from the the sort of traditional domain to sort of everyday experience, and they're mutually reinforcing in that way. It's perhaps easy, and much of this material has been the subject of literary critical analysis of genre. And I think, it's easy to focus on those forms and formats and styles and forget about the real context in which they often emerged, and sometimes our inability to make clear distinctions between what are these sort of contrivances to deploy the trope of the mother's legacy and the father's legacy from the situations that were happening in deathbeds and in private houses. So it's a difficult one to sort of do more than speculate about, but I think that's very much at the heart of what I'm trying to argue.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Colin. Raisa.
Yes, thank you for a very inspiring paper and lecture. My question is kind of a follow-up, or maybe turning the previous one into slightly different wordings, because you talk a lot about genre and how it is about, and genre is about the mediation and expression of experience. But since the genre is there and it continues the mediation and expression, can it also be thought of as a cultural script that is only about how you tell about your experiences to other people or mediate them to other people, but something that actually directs to creation of the actual experience?
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. It's a two-way process, isn't it? And just as other texts and resources provide those scripts in this culture, the Bible, the prayer books, and so on, so too there's this feed into that, sort of social universe that shapes how people, and the lens, I think you used the word, the lens through which people see their world. I think this is also, these literary sort of conventions that appear to be very familiar are actually the spectacles through which they understand their world and their experiences.
Thank you. And related to that, I suppose, the thing you really drew attention to so eloquently, Alex, of the transcribers, often religious ministers putting things into print, drawing attention to the process of creating the document, or the evidence of subsequent inheritors of the documents, like Alice Thornton's descendants writing themselves in as owners, might speak to those processes as well. Mary Claire has added a comment in the chat I'll just read. She draws attention to some examples of printed legacies of children, often in the form of funeral sermons. And we have John Janeway's work in the 1670s, and she wonders if there were earlier printed examples of dying children as exemplars. And I confess I can't think of any off the top of my head. I don't know if you know, Alex, of any more.
Yeah, there are some examples. I sort of showed on one of the slides the case of the wise virgin, Martha Hatfield.
Oh, yeah.
And there
of course.
Some examples certainly before that, and the work of Hannah Newton and Anna Fletcher has looked quite closely at some of that material. So yes, there are examples of that, but they do increase in volume and number in the later 17th and 18th century.
Thank you.
And now I'll just read a question from Claudia that I can see in the chat, who says, can we therefore say that those texts are closer to the idea of performed or stylized lived religion? Thinking about how in texts and images of the period, we see that lived religion is fashioned, is constructed in religion and in literature and iconography. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that something that came out in the discussion earlier in the day was, that one shouldn't, I think, contrast performance with, spontaneity and see that the latter as characterizing lived religion and not the former, because I think performativity is actually at the heart of all the sort of social practice, isn't it? So I think that's perhaps another of those sort of tempting polarities that aren't helpful so often, but which we often have to use as a heuristic device to advance our arguments, really, don't we? So.
Okay, I think we've got time to squeeze in one more question, which I can see from Rama in the chat. Was there discrimination in inheritance? And I suppose, is that registered in these texts, the sort of contrast of the complementarity of financial inheritance and spiritual inheritance?
That's a very good and interesting point, actually. As I said, this is a culture where primogeniture, the elder son is the priority here. But so often, as some of my examples showed, they are, they're for all the offspring, male and female. And actually, interestingly, sometimes those texts then are about children who've died. So they're about the dead as well as the living and the successors. But there's also very good examples of where multiple copies are explicitly commanded and commissioned to be produced for all the members of the family, and that sort of copying, promiscuous copying of these texts, but they spill outside the realm of the immediate blood family into the wider kith and kin and the friends and the religious communities of which they're part. So there's a very strong sense of the family as an expansive concept at the time.
Thank you very much. Let me just check. I think I see that we're at 5 o'clock now, so I think we should close for the day so that we can have a rest from our screens and come back refreshed tomorrow. But I really want to thank you, Alex, and all the speakers today for really introducing our topic with such variety and richness and generosity as well of the intellectual encounter. It's been really, really stimulating. And tomorrow we join at 10 a.m, still British summertime, for panels on lived religion and the emotions and encounters with Islam, and another early career showcase, and in the afternoon a session from Kat Hill, who been listening today, I know. So I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Lawrence, is there anything else to say at this stage, or just to wish everyone a good evening?
I don't think there's anything else to say. Again, you know, our renewed and heartfelt thanks to everybody for joining this event, to all our speakers. I'd like perhaps a little special mention for our MA students who came up with questions there towards the end. And I know that, you know, when you are a shy and retiring MA student, it's not necessarily an easy thing to do. So thank you very much for doing that. And we hope you can join us in great numbers again tomorrow for the events that Tessa has outlined right now. I think the Zoom link will remain the same. I hope everything works. If it doesn't, I will obviously send you all an email with a new and refreshed link.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye until tomorrow.
Everybody, see you tomorrow.
Thank you.